November 17, 1944, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The transport trucks rolled through gates bearing the American Eagle, carrying 42 German women who had crossed an ocean as prisoners of a war they were still trying to understand. Inside the covered vehicles, they sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with salt spray and travel dust, their faces reflecting the exhaustion of 3 weeks at sea in cramped cargo holds. They had been captured in France during the final Allied push, serving as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for Wehrmacht units that had crumbled under the American advance. Now they found themselves in a country they had been taught to view as their enemy, a land of supposed decadence and weakness that had somehow managed to cross the Atlantic and defeat the armies of the Reich. Ottilie Huber pressed her face against the canvas opening, catching glimpses of a landscape that seemed impossibly green and untouched by war. At 26, she had spent the last 4 years watching her homeland disappear under bomb craters and rubble. The sight of intact buildings and paved roads felt almost obscene in its normalcy. Beside her, Lucia Steiner clutched a small photograph of her family in Stuttgart, the edges worn soft from constant handling. She was only 19, young enough that she could barely remember a time before rationing, before the constant gnawing presence of hunger had become as familiar as breathing. The truck stopped outside a compound of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing. American soldiers, looking impossibly young and well-fed, gestured for the women to disembark. As Ottilie stepped down, her legs unsteady after the long journey, she noticed something that made her pause. The guards weren't pointing rifles at them with the aggression she had expected. Instead, they maintained a professional distance that seemed almost respectful. One soldier, a corporal, with kind eyes and dark skin, offered his hand to help Wilhelmine Graf down from the high truck bed. Minna, as she was called, hesitated before accepting, her face showing confusion at this unexpected courtesy. They were led to a processing building where American women in military uniforms recorded their information. The female officers spoke in careful, slow English, occasionally consulting German phrase books when communication faltered. Franziska Becker, who had studied English in school before the war made such education seem like a betrayal, found herself serving as an impromptu translator. Her accent was thick, her vocabulary limited, but she could bridge the gap between the terrified women and the Americans who seemed genuinely concerned about their comfort and health. After processing, they were directed to a mess hall for their first meal. The building was larger than any dining facility Ottilie had seen in Germany for years, and as they entered, the smell hit them like a physical force. Real coffee, bread that wasn't made from sawdust and potato peels, meat. The women stood frozen in the doorway, their eyes adjusting to the bright lights and their minds trying to comprehend the scene before them. Long tables were set with metal trays, and American staff were ladling food onto plates with a casualness that suggested this abundance was ordinary, expected, normal. To understand why 42 German women stood paralyzed at the sight of an ordinary American mess hall, one must first understand what hunger had done to Europe. Not the simple hunger of a missed meal or a delayed dinner, but the grinding, relentless hunger that had become the permanent condition of German life by 1944. Ottilie Huber remembered the last time she had eaten until she felt full. It was December of 1941, a Christmas dinner her mother had somehow managed to prepare using hoarded rations and connections with farmers outside Hamburg. Real goose, potatoes fried in actual butter, and a small cake made with precious sugar that had cost her mother a week's worth of tobacco rations. Ottilie had been 23 then, working as a switchboard operator for the Postal Service, still believing that the war would end quickly and life would return to the comfortable middle-class existence her family had known. By 1942, the rations had been cut again. Bread became darker, denser, stretched with additives that left a chalky residue in the mouth. Meat appeared once a week if they were lucky, usually as a thin slice of something that might have been pork or might have been horse. Her mother had learned to make coffee from roasted acorns and chicory, a bitter brew that bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing. They told themselves it was temporary, that victory would restore abundance, that sacrifice was patriotic duty. Lucia Steiner's memories of food were even more stark. She had been only 15 when the war began, young enough that rationing became her normal. She learned to eat potato peels, fried until crispy, to drink ersatz tea made from apple leaves, to stretch a single egg across an entire week by mixing it with water and grain. Her mother had worked in a munitions factory, coming home with blackened fingers and a cough that never quite disappeared. The factory provided one hot meal per shift, a watery soup with occasional chunks of turnip or cabbage. Lucia remembered fighting with her younger brother over who would get the slightly larger portion, remembered the shame of that fight, the way hunger could turn siblings into competitors. When Lucia had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, part of her motivation had been the promise of regular meals. Military personnel received better rations than civilians, or so the recruitment posters had claimed. The reality had been only marginally better. Army kitchens served dark bread with margarine, thin soups flavored with meat extracts, and the occasional celebration meal that included real sausage or cheese. She had learned to eat quickly, to never leave a crumb, to view food as fuel rather than pleasure. Wilhelmine Graf had come from a wealthy family in Munich, people who had once hosted dinner parties with multiple courses and French wines. By the time she joined the Auxiliary Corps at age 28, her family's silver had been donated to the war effort, their wine cellar was empty, and her mother had learned to make soap from kitchen scraps. Minna remembered the strange humiliation of teaching her mother, who had employed cooks her entire life, how to render fat and mix lye. Wealth meant nothing when there was nothing to buy. The American mess hall staff seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. Sergeant Dorothy Williams, a heavy-set woman from Georgia with warm brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured for the German women to form a line. She spoke in English that none of them fully understood, but her meaning was clear from her gestures. Take a tray, move down the line, accept the food being offered. The process was simple, mechanical, yet the women approached it with the caution of soldiers entering a minefield. Ottilie was third in line. She watched as Nutburga Keller, a tall woman from Berlin who everyone called Burga, received her tray, a serving of roasted chicken, the skin still crispy and golden, a mound of mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting into a golden pool, green beans that looked fresh rather than preserved, a thick slice of white bread, and then, unexpectedly, a small bowl containing something pale and creamy that Ottilie couldn't immediately identify. Burga stood holding her tray as if it might explode, her hands trembling slightly under the unexpected weight of so much food. When Ottilie reached the serving line, she found herself staring at Sergeant Williams with undisguised confusion. The American woman smiled and pointed to each item, speaking slowly. Chicken, potatoes, beans, bread. Then she picked up the small bowl and her smile widened. Rice pudding. You'll like it. It's sweet. Ottilie had studied enough English to understand the word sweet, but rice pudding was unfamiliar. In Germany, rice had been a luxury even before the war, usually reserved for special occasions or hospital patients. The idea of rice as a dessert seemed almost wasteful, decadent, in a way that made her uncomfortable. The women carried their trays to the long tables and sat in a tight cluster, instinctively separating themselves from the American personnel who were eating their own meals at nearby tables. For a long moment, nobody moved. They simply stared at the food before them, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they knew about captivity, about war, about how enemies were supposed to treat each other. Franziska finally broke the silence, speaking in German. Is this some kind of test? Are they watching to see how we behave? Her voice carried the paranoia that had become second nature after years of living under suspicion and surveillance. Crescentia Voigt, who everyone called Zenzi, shook her head slowly. She was 31, older than most of them, and had worked as a nurse before the war. I've heard stories about American POW camps. They follow the Geneva Convention, real food, medical care, humane treatment. She paused, picking up her fork with hesitant fingers. I never believed the stories were true. She cut a small piece of chicken, examining it as if it might contain hidden meanings. Then she placed it in her mouth, and her eyes closed. Real meat, properly seasoned, cooked with care, rather than simply boiled into submission. The taste was so far removed from her recent memories of food that she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. The chicken disappeared first. 42 women ate with the focused intensity of people who had forgotten what satisfaction felt like. They used their forks with proper etiquette at first, maintaining the dignity that had been drilled into them during their upbringing and military training. But as the meal progressed, as the reality of abundance began to sink into their consciousness, something shifted. Veronica Meyer, called Vroni by her friends, found herself using bread to soak up every trace of butter from her potatoes. She caught herself doing it and felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she couldn't stop. The richness of real butter was too precious to waste. Teresia Kohler, known as Raisi, had been raised in a convent school where table manners were considered a reflection of moral character. She had always eaten with careful precision, never rushing, never showing excessive enthusiasm for food. But now she found herself eating faster than she intended, driven by some primal fear that the food might disappear if she didn't consume it quickly. She forced herself to slow down, to breathe, to remember who she was supposed to be. Yet her fork kept moving almost of its own accord, carrying green beans to her mouth with mechanical efficiency. The rice pudding sat untouched in its small bowl beside each woman's main plate. They had avoided it during the meal, unsure whether it was meant to be eaten first or last, uncertain about what it even was. Luzia picked up her bowl and examined its contents closely. The pudding was pale cream in color, with a slight golden skin on top. She could see grains of rice suspended in what appeared to be sweetened milk, and there was a dusting of something dark on the surface. Cinnamon, perhaps, though she hadn't encountered real cinnamon in years. Josephine Herman, called Sefi, was the first to taste it. At 20 years old, she was among the youngest in the group, and her curiosity overcame her caution. She dipped her spoon into the pudding and brought it to her lips. The sweetness hit her tongue first, real sugar, rather than the saccharine substitutes they had been living on. Then came the creamy richness of milk that hadn't been watered down or stretched with additives. The rice itself was soft, almost dissolving on contact, and the cinnamon added a warmth that seemed to spread through her entire body. Her eyes widened, and she made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh. That sound drew every eye to her. "It's sweet," she whispered in German, her voice carrying an almost religious reverence. "Really sweet, like dessert from before the war." The other women watched her take a second spoonful, then a third. She ate with increasing speed, no longer bothering with careful small bites. Within moments, she had finished the entire bowl. And then, without thinking, she raised it to her lips and tilted it back to capture every last trace of the creamy mixture that clung to the sides. The sight of Sefi licking her bowl broke something in the group. Whatever remained of their carefully maintained dignity dissolved like sugar in warm milk. Ottilie found herself doing the same, tilting her bowl to her lips with both hands like a child desperate not to waste a single drop. Across the table, Wilhelmine watched herself perform the same action in a kind of shocked detachment, as if observing someone else's behavior. This was not how a woman from a respected Munich family was supposed to act. This was not the bearing of a soldier, even a defeated one. Yet she couldn't stop herself, and the sweetness coating her tongue felt worth any amount of shame. Sergeant Williams watched from across the mess hall with an expression that was difficult to read. She had served meals to German prisoners before, male soldiers who had maintained their military composure even in captivity. But she had never witnessed anything quite like this. 42 women, most of them young, reduced to childlike wonder by something as simple as rice pudding. She turned to Private Robert Chen, who was standing beside her with his own tray. "Did you see that?" she asked quietly. "Have you ever seen anyone so hungry they'd lick the bowl clean in front of strangers?" Chen nodded slowly. His parents had fled China during the Japanese invasion, and he carried his own memories of hunger, of desperation, of what scarcity could do to human behavior. "They're starving," he said simply. "Not just now, but for years. You can see it in how they hold themselves, how they look at food. My mother used to say that hunger lives in your bones even after your stomach is full." He watched as Lucia carefully ran her finger around the inside of her bowl, unwilling to let even the smallest amount of pudding go to waste. "We should give them more." William shook her head, but not unkindly. "Can't, not yet. Their stomachs need time to adjust. If we overfeed them now after years of malnutrition, it could make them sick." She had read the medical briefings about refeeding prisoners from concentration camps and extended captivity. The body needed time to remember how to process abundance. "But tomorrow," she added, making a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire camp, "tomorrow we teach them how to make it themselves." The next morning, Williams appeared at the women's barracks with an unexpected announcement. Through Franziska's halting translation, she explained that any prisoners interested in working in the kitchen would be welcome. There would be additional food privileges, opportunities to learn American cooking, and most importantly, something to do with their hands and minds beyond sitting in barracks contemplating their uncertain futures. Every single woman volunteered. Williams had expected perhaps a dozen, but all 42 raised their hands with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. She smiled and nodded, then selected 10 for the first rotation. Ottilie, Lucia, Wilhelmina, Franziska, Crescentia, Veronica, Teresia, Josephine, Notburga, and Kunigunda Seidel, who insisted everyone call her Kuni. The kitchen rotation began the following Monday, but before the women could lose themselves in the comfort of cooking and abundance, reality arrived in the form of mail call. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication between prisoners and their families, a process complicated by the chaos of a collapsing Reich and Allied bombing campaigns that had destroyed postal infrastructure across Germany. On December 3, 1944, the first batch of letters reached Camp Shelby. Ottilie received a single thin envelope, the paper so cheap it was nearly transparent. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, less controlled than she remembered, and entire sections had been blacked out by military censors. But enough remained to paint a devastating picture. Hamburg had been bombed again in October. Their apartment building had survived, but the bakery on the corner where Ottilie had bought bread as a child was gone, along with the family who had run it for 3 generations. Her younger sister was working in a munitions factory 16 hours a day. Food rations had been cut again. Her mother wrote about making soup from nettles gathered in the rubble of destroyed buildings, about trading her wedding ring for a sack of potatoes, about how the sound of air raid sirens no longer caused panic because they had all become numb to the constant threat of death. The letter ended with a sentence that had somehow escaped the censor's pen. "We are so hungry, Tilly. Every day we are so hungry." Ottilie read those words 3 times, sitting on her bunk with her knees pulled to her chest. She had eaten rice pudding yesterday. She had licked the bowl clean like a child and felt shame at her lack of dignity. Her mother was making soup from weeds, and Ottilie had felt embarrassed about showing too much enthusiasm for dessert. Lucia's letter was worse. It came from a neighbor, not from her mother, and the news it contained made her hands shake so badly she couldn't hold the paper steady. Her mother had died in September during a bombing raid on the munitions factory where she worked. Her younger brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch militia of old men and children that Hitler had created as the Reich crumbled. The neighbor had no information about whether he was still alive. Their apartment had been requisitioned by party officials. Everything Lucia had known, everyone she had loved, was either dead, missing, or scattered beyond any hope of reunion. She sat in the barracks holding the letter, making no sound, her face completely blank. Ottilie moved to sit beside her, uncertain what comfort could possibly be offered. Around them, other women were reading their own letters, and similar scenes of quiet devastation were unfolding across the room. Wilhelmine had learned that her family's home in Munich had been destroyed. Veronica discovered that her father had been killed on the Eastern Front. Teresia found out that her sister's children had been evacuated to the countryside, and no one knew where they had been sent. The letters created a profound shift in the atmosphere of the camp. The women moved through their days, carrying the weight of knowledge they couldn't fully process. They were being fed 3 meals a day, sleeping in heated barracks with real mattresses, while their families starved and died in the ruins of cities they could no longer recognize. The guilt was suffocating, made worse by the fact that their bodies continued to respond to proper nutrition with almost embarrassing gratitude. Within 2 weeks of regular meals, color had returned to their cheeks, their hair had begun to shine again, and they found themselves with energy that had been absent for years. Sergeant Williams noticed the change immediately, not in their physical appearance, but in their demeanor. The women who reported for kitchen duty moved like automatons, their hands performing tasks while their minds remained somewhere far away, trapped in the rubble of Hamburg or Munich or Stuttgart. She understood enough about grief to know that keeping them busy was kindness, not cruelty. So she threw herself into teaching them American cooking with an intensity that surprised even her own staff. The kitchen became an unlikely sanctuary. Ottilie found herself standing beside Sergeant Williams at a large wooden table, learning to measure ingredients for rice pudding. The process was explained in simple English, with Williams speaking slowly and using her hands to demonstrate. 2 cups of rice, 4 cups of milk, half a cup of sugar. She pointed to each measuring cup as she spoke, then gestured for Ottilie to repeat the process. The measurements were so generous, so wasteful by German standards, that Ottilie hesitated before pouring. 4 entire cups of milk for a single batch of pudding. Her mother had been trading wedding rings for potatoes, and here she was, pouring milk like it was water. Williams noticed the hesitation and placed a gentle hand on Ottilie's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "There's plenty, more than plenty." She didn't know if Ottilie understood the words, but she hoped the tone conveyed what language couldn't. This wasn't a trick or a test. This was simply how America fed its people, even its prisoners. The abundance wasn't exceptional, it was ordinary. Lucia worked at the stove, stirring a large pot under the watchful eye of Private Chen. He had taken it upon himself to teach her the basics of American cooking, using a combination of English lessons and cooking demonstrations. "Stir slowly," he said, moving his hand in a circular motion. "Langsam," he added, proud of the German word he had learned. Lucia looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and attempted a smile. The gesture cost her visible effort, but she managed it. "Langsam," she repeated, and continued stirring. Across the kitchen, Wilhelmine and Franziska were learning to make vanilla sauce, a sweet accompaniment that Williams insisted was essential for proper rice pudding. Franziska translated Williams's instructions into German, creating a strange, trilingual dance of cooking education. She says we must heat it gently, not boiling, or the eggs will scramble. The first batch of rice pudding made by German hands emerged from the oven on December 15th. The women had worked together under Sergeant Williams's supervision, measuring and stirring and tasting with a concentration that went beyond simple cooking instruction. When Williams pulled the large pan from the oven, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla, and something shifted in the air. This wasn't just food anymore. This was an act of creation, a small reclamation of agency in lives that had been defined by powerlessness for too long. Williams divided the pudding into serving bowls and did something that shocked everyone present. She took 6 bowls and gestured for the German women to sit at the small kitchen table usually reserved for staff. Then she served them first, before any American personnel, before following any protocol about prisoners and guards maintaining proper separation. She placed a bowl in front of Ottilie, then Lucia, then each woman in turn. "You made this," she said simply. "You should taste it first." The women stared at their bowls, then at Williams, then at each other. Notburga spoke in careful English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "This is not how prisoners are treated." It wasn't a question or a complaint, simply a statement of fact that contained within it a lifetime of assumptions about hierarchy, about power, about who deserved kindness and who deserved punishment. Williams pulled out a chair and sat down at the table with them, taking her own bowl. "This is how people are treated," she replied. "Just people, making food together and sharing what they made." She took a spoonful of the pudding and nodded with satisfaction. "You did good work. Be proud of it." Private Chen joined them at the table, followed by 2 other kitchen staff members. Within moments, the small table was crowded with both American soldiers and German prisoners, eating rice pudding and attempting conversations in broken English and even more broken German. Chen tried to explain where his family had come from, using hand gestures to indicate the Pacific Ocean and the long journey from China. Kunigunde attempted to describe Munich in peacetime, before the bombs, when the city had been beautiful and whole. The conversation was halting, awkward, punctuated by long silences and misunderstandings. But it was conversation nonetheless, the first genuine human exchange that had occurred between the 2 groups beyond simple orders and compliance. Crescentia found herself laughing at Chen's attempt to pronounce Guten Tag, his tone all wrong despite his earnest effort. The sound of her own laughter startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, couldn't remember when her face had last arranged itself into an expression of genuine joy rather than forced politeness or resigned acceptance. Josephine asked Williams a question in German, then looked frustrated when the sergeant didn't understand. Franziska translated haltingly. "She wants to know why you are kind to us. We were your enemies. We served the Reich. Why do you teach us to cook and sit with us like friends?" Williams set down her spoon and took a long moment before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone at the table fall silent. "My brother died at Normandy," she said quietly. Franziska translated in a whisper, and the German women froze, their faces reflecting horror and shame. Williams continued, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "He was 22 years old, good kid. Wanted to be a teacher when he got home. German machine gun got him on the beach." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ottilie felt her throat constrict, felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes. How could this woman sit at a table with them, teach them to cook, serve them food with her own hands, knowing that people like them had killed her brother? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, impossible to reconcile with everything they had been taught about enemies and warfare, and the absolute nature of national loyalty. "I could hate you for that," Williams continued, her voice steady. "I could treat you the way anger tells me to treat you, but my brother, he wrote me a letter before he died. Last letter I got from him." She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, handling it with the careful reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "He said he was scared, said he didn't want to die, but he also said something that I think about every single day." She unfolded the letter with practiced care, the paper soft from countless readings. He wrote, "Dottie, I'm fighting people I don't even know. People who probably have sisters just like you, mothers just like ours. When this is over, somebody's got to remember that we're all just people trying to get home. Don't let the war make you forget that. So I teach you to cook rice pudding. Because my brother asked me not to forget your people, that's why." Franziska's voice broke as she translated the final words. Several women were crying openly now, tears streaming down their faces as they grappled with a kindness that was somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could have understood, could have absorbed into their existing understanding of the world. This generosity, this deliberate choice to see humanity in the face of personal loss, shattered every framework they had for understanding how the world worked. Lucia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, everyone thought she might flee, might run from the unbearable weight of Williams's forgiveness. Instead, she moved around the table and stood before the sergeant, her thin frame trembling. "Danke," she whispered, then switched to English, the word coming out choked and desperate. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing us." She held out her hand, a gesture that violated every protocol about prisoner and guard interaction. Williams looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then stood and took it, gripping it firmly. Then she did something even more unexpected. She pulled Lucia into a brief, fierce hug. 23 years later, in 1968, Ottilie Huber Martinez stood in the kitchen of her home in San Antonio, Texas, teaching her daughter how to make rice pudding. Her English was flawless now, barely touched by the accent that had once marked every word she spoke. Her daughter, Maria, was 16 and had never known hunger, had never experienced the gnawing emptiness that had once defined her mother's existence. She complained about measuring the milk, about how long the pudding took to cook, about the heat of the Texas summer making the kitchen unbearable. Ottilie listened to these complaints with the patience of someone who understood their true value. Her daughter could afford to be annoyed by minor inconveniences because she had never faced major ones. That was the gift Ottilie had worked 23 years to give her, the privilege of taking abundance for granted. "Stir slowly," she told Maria, placing her hand over her daughter's to guide the motion. "If you rush it, the rice won't absorb the milk properly. Good things take time." Maria rolled her eyes with the casual dismissiveness of teenagers everywhere, but she slowed her stirring. "Mom, why do we make this old-fashioned dessert anyway? Nobody eats rice pudding anymore. It's weird." Ottilie smiled, the expression carrying layers of meaning her daughter couldn't possibly understand. "Because rice pudding taught me what America really means," she said simply. "And someday when you're older, I'll tell you that whole story." The other women from Camp Shelby had scattered across America, building lives that would have seemed impossible during those first days of captivity. Lucia had married a doctor from Chicago and worked as a translator for refugee services, helping other displaced persons navigate the complexities of American immigration. Wilhelmine had become a teacher in Boston, educating a new generation about the dangers of blind nationalism and the possibility of redemption. Franziska ran a bakery in Philadelphia where she made both German and American desserts, creating bridges between cultures, one pastry at a time. They stayed in touch through letters and occasional reunions, and every single one of them kept rice pudding as a staple in their homes. Their American-born children found it strange, this devotion to a dessert that seemed quaint and old-fashioned. But the women knew what their children could never fully grasp. Rice pudding wasn't just food. It was the taste of the moment when they had understood that enemies could choose to become something else, that nations at war could still contain individuals capable of breathtaking kindness. Sergeant Dorothy Williams had attended Ottilie's wedding in 1951, standing as a witness when Ottilie married Roberto Martinez, a Mexican-American soldier she had met at a veterans' social event. Williams had cried during the ceremony, thinking of her brother who never got to come home, who never got to see the peace he had died to create. But she had also felt something close to satisfaction, knowing that his last letter had not been written in vain, that his request for her to remember the humanity of their enemies had led to real friendship, real transformation, real healing.